In this video, I want to talk a little bit about the Canon T4i or 650D and the Nikon D5200. I already have a video up that talks about the physical similarities and differences, and spoiler alert, they're very, very similar in size, shape, and weight. This video more is my observations after shooting with both of these cameras and kind of a general what each offers, and I hope that it'll make you be able to make a decision about which camera is right for you, because both cameras are excellent. They are capable of making very excellent pictures and video in a variety of conditions, but one has a few features that another doesn't, and vice versa. So let's dive right in and talk about the options that the Canon T4i or 650D provides you. So I think there are two highlight features of this T4i. That is the touchscreen and the continuous silent autofocus. Now, the touchscreen is an optional use because all of the physical buttons are still on this camera, but you activate it with a little Q button on the side here. I didn't think I would like it, honestly. I thought that I wouldn't want to be touching my screen all the time where I'm looking to see how sharp my pictures are, and it's going to have finger smudges and things like that. One, it doesn't pick up smudges much. Two, it really makes all of the features of the camera easily accessible. And I think this is especially important for people who are new to DSLRs, moving up from point and shoots with fairly simple interfaces. Suddenly you have a much more complex beast, and this touchscreen makes accessing all of these features just a little bit more user-friendly. And that's important because the best camera to take pictures with is the one you are most comfortable with. Now, I currently have the 18-55 kit lens on here. It will do continuous autofocus. The Nikon also does continuous autofocus, but when you put the 18-135 STM on, that continuous autofocus is silent during video, and that's a big plus. Now, it's not fast enough for professional use. Professionals never rely on autofocus anyway, but it is fast enough and capable enough for your kind of family-friendly environments. I guess it doesn't necessarily have to be friendly, but family-type environments. Your kid on stage or panning around of a scenic view. The video autofocusing capabilities are quite capable in those settings. As I said, the Nikon does offer the continuous autofocus as well, but it doesn't offer any silent lenses to do that. And that STM lens is built slightly differently, and it doesn't have to make as much rotational change to focus, and so it's a little bit smoother at keeping things in focus. Another feature of the T4i that I like that might be interesting to you or not is the ability to control off-camera flashes wirelessly. So using the pop-up flash, you can send out a signal, tells other flashes to fire. If there's one way to improve your indoor photos, and even outdoor, but indoor in particular, it is to use an external flash. The next step beyond that is to get your external flash off the top of your camera and someplace else in the room, and the T4i has that all built in. You can certainly buy wireless flash triggers and setups for other cameras, but they cost a couple $100 for the good ones, about $100 for the cheaper ones. Another feature that I like, and it falls into the category of kind of helping you to learn photography, is the fact that you can change your aperture with live view is on in any of the basic modes, or sorry, creative modes, M, AV, TV, and P. You can change your aperture. So you turn live view on, it's running on the back of the camera, it's showing you, and if the screen is too bright or your exposure is too bright, because that's what the screen is simulating, your exposure, you simply dial it down and you can make that change. The Nikon is a little quirky, and live view does not always allow you to change your aperture depending on the setting. So there are times where you'll enter into live view, realize that your aperture is not set the way you want, you have to exit out of live view and change it and then re-enter. And certainly there's an exposure meter on the back of both of these cameras that is telling you what your exposure, but I find that the that the LCD screen on the back is a really nice way to see your exposure and see what the camera, and that tells you a little bit more than just the meter. So I think that's a really nice feature. It also allows you to shoot multiple aspect ratios. And I bring that up because I've actually been asked about that quite a bit lately. You can shoot in 1:1, 16:9, all of those you have to shoot. You do have to shoot in JPEG or shoot in RAW and bring it into Canon software to see those aspect ratios. If you shoot in RAW and bring it into Lightroom, it does ignore those. The Nikon only allows you to shoot in the standard aspect ratio, but does have a retouch menu that you can crop with later. We'll talk about that. I said these two cameras were very similar in size and shape, and that is mostly true, but the Canon does give you just a little bit more space for larger hands back here. Your thumb can rest up through that spot without hitting any other buttons. On the Nikon side, that spot is really just a spot that your thumb can rest, and I call my hands normal sized hands. They comes up across and rests on some buttons. It's not a terrible thing, but it is a difference to note if you have larger hands. These two cameras really are something that if you haven't decided because of a feature set, you should spend some time putting your hands on each and see what feels nicer in your hands. That might help you make a decision. The T4i has a built-in focus motor. It will autofocus with basically all of Canon's current lenses. Nikon entry-level series does not. I'm mentioning this, but it's not nearly as big a deal as it was just a few years ago. And the reason being, Nikon has now released a handful of lenses that kind of fill in those gaps that used to be there and no longer missing. And the last thing that I want to talk about on the T4i that I appreciate is in the menu system, there is a custom menu tab, and you can put your frequently used items on that, and it makes it very easy and very quick. If you shoot video with this frequently, you can put all of your video features under that tab and always have quick access to them. The Nikon, on the other hand, offers a recently used menu system, which is useful as well. But I kind of appreciate being able to set up a menu, knowing what features are going to be there every time, and that works well for me. What the D5200 offers, let's talk a little bit about that. I think the big leading off feature is the focusing brain in here. We got 39 autofocusing points. T4i has 9. I didn't see a huge difference in focusing, both in good light and low light, but there were times where the Nikon clearly focused faster and more accurately than the Canon. And obviously having 39 points, you have a little bit more range as to what you're focusing on and letting the camera decide what it's focusing on. The other big feature or big difference that I think are going to really matter to some folks is better low light performance. At the higher ISOs, 1600 and above, both in stills and video, the Nikon did a very nice job. This was noise reduction off on both. One thing to note though is that you bring both of these files into Lightroom, and with just a couple tweaks you can make them indistinguishable from one another no matter what ISO you originally shot at. So we're not talking differences that are irreversible in post-processing, but straight out of the camera, the Nikon is going to be shooting less noisy images and video at the higher ISOs. More megapixels as well. We have 24 megapixels in the Nikon, 18 in the Canon. I'd like to say that the megapixel race is over, but it's not really. The camera makers are still kind of shoving them in there. A downside of having those more megapixels is something you see is just a little bit slower operation on the Nikon, especially when you're shooting in RAW mode. Just a little bit longer to view your image on the back, and in burst mode, the Nikon cannot keep up with the Canon. In the first few seconds it does just fine, and then it quickly starts to lag way behind. Throw up a shot of waveforms of the T4i shooting JPEG, RAW, and the Nikon D5200 shooting JPEG and RAW. Each of those peaks is the shutter, and so you can see as you get away from that first few seconds, the Nikon really starts to space out in the RAW and even in the JPEG. Not a huge deal because, again, there's probably not that many times where you're going to be holding down the shutter for 5 to 10 seconds. And again, in that first 5 seconds, these two cameras are pretty similar. I just mentioned burst mode. The Nikon does offer a few more shutter options. The high speed, which is the same as the Canon, 5 frames a second roughly. It also offers a medium speed, I'm going to call it that. That's not what it actually calls in the menu. It's about 3 frames per second. And then there's a quiet shutter, which flips the mirror down just a little bit later after your shutter fires. And it's actually the mirror flipping up and flipping down where most of the sound comes from in these cameras when you're firing, when you're taking a picture. And honestly, I don't notice a lot of difference from its regular shutter sound, but there is a difference. On the video side, we have 1080p at 60 frames a second. The catch is that's interlaced, which most people agree is not quite as good as progressive, and it crops the image just a little bit more. And again, it's not a bad thing, it's just something to be aware of. That's only at the 60 frames per second though. You drop back down to the 1080p at 24 frames per second and it's filling the screen the same as it is on Canon. Video quality and good light, same on both of these cameras. A few more effects and scene modes, and I'll have a video covering those soon, but you know, mostly the same across these two, but the Nikon does have a few more, and this is also one that I was asked for about the other day. It does have the color select. That's where you can shoot a picture and say that red rose should be red, but everything else should be in grayscale or black and white. It does have that built in. The Canon does not have that, but fisheye, miniature, painterly effect, those are all built in there. And I touched on this, but when I mentioned the cropping, there is a, or the aspect ratio cropping, there is a really robust retouch menu built into the T4i, so you can take your images that are in here and do a good bit of retouching to them. You can do some retouching on the Canon side, but not nearly as much. You even have red eye reduction, and that's not available to you on the Canon side. Personally, I would do all of that stuff on the computer afterwards, because you're going to have better control and better results. But it is nice to have those features built into the camera. There is also an intervalometer built in, but there's a little asterisk after I just said that, so hold on, we'll come back to that. And doesn't come with the camera, but there is a tiny little wireless dongle that you can pick up for just 60 bucks. Which I think is a pretty reasonable price. It slides into one of these little ports on the side of the camera here, and it allows you to use your smartphone, Android or iOS, as the viewfinder and as a remote. So it's pretty nice for setting up a self-timer picture. You can point it at yourself, you walk over to the group, you can see yourself on the screen, and when you're ready you can push the button, and then that picture will be taken and sent over to your phone. It's a direct connect wireless feature. It uses the Wi-Fi. It does impact battery life a little bit, but it's pretty nice to have that option. Nothing like that on the T4i side. There is iFi card support, of course, but that's not a remote wireless trigger. Now, I mentioned the intervalometer. I also mentioned the changing of the aperture and live view. These are a couple quirks that the Nikon has. Another one is I feel like it does tend to cast a little bit of a greenish tint. Its auto white balance isn't quite as smart as the Canon's most of the time. It's a little hard to make generalizations, but it did seem to be fooled a little bit more often than the Canon. In general, I was kind of more pleased with the colors that came straight out of the Canon. Again, something easily correctable in post, but the less correcting you have to do in post, the happier you are and the more time you have to shoot. I mentioned that intervalometer. I think that's a really neat feature. It's basic, but it's in there. But the several times that I used it, it just would stop. It would be taking pictures for a while. Battery life was fine. The camera was fine. There were no error messages. It just stopped taking those pictures. And I could start it again, but there'd be a gap in my time lapse. So, you know, it's just a little strange. So that was a good bit of stuff. And I think if you were to kind of count the bullets that I just went through, the Nikon has a clear advantage in number of bullets, but I think that depending on who you are, some of those bullets have more weight than others. And on the Canon side, if I had to pick the highlights, it's that user-friendly touchscreen, it's that continuous and silent autofocus when paired with the 18-135. And I don't want to get into a price discussion because prices change, but right now you can get that 18-135 and the T4i for the same price as the Nikon with the 18-55. That's right now. In the future things change, and so the value of these cameras will change somewhat. But I think that this is a more approachable, family-friendly camera because of that touchscreen and that automatic autofocus. The highlights on the Nikon side, I'm repeating myself again, but really smart and fast focusing brain in there. That is definitely worth something. You do have more megapixels and you do have better performance in lower light. One more thing to mention, because you are buying these cameras, but you're also buying into these companies most likely. You're kind of starting down a track where as you start to collect lenses, it becomes harder and harder to jump ship and go to the other side. There's very rarely is it ever worth it to jump ship and go to the other side. Both of these camera makers have been making cameras. One may be a little bit better than the other for a period of time, but they're back and forth and right there. And as I said, these two cameras right now are both capable of producing really nice images. But it is important to note that Nikon doesn't have a stellar record of customer service. I have heard more than a few horror stories about really struggling to get them to honor warranties or to admit that something is wrong. They've shipped a couple of their bigger, higher profile cameras in the last couple of years with issues with them, and Nikon says, nope, everything is fine. It's not to say Canon hasn't done that. In fact, the T4i, when it first started shipping, had some kind of chemical treatment problem with the grip. It was turning white and it was getting on people's hands, and you know, it wasn't great, but I feel like Canon responded fairly quickly to that. Voluntary recall, you could send it in, they would fix it for you or give you a new camera if you needed that. And I think that's the right way to respond. Nikon, not as much. And so that's just something to keep in mind. So, which should you buy? I mean, this is a very feature-rich and powerful camera. I find this one to be a little bit more user-friendly, and I think that's all I want to say. If you have questions about these cameras, please leave them in the comments down below or come over onto my Facebook page. I would welcome questions. I'm happy to answer them. And I really appreciate you watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe. There's going to be lots more videos coming about both of these cameras. And I hope you have a nice day. Thank you.